Knox, an elite Navy SEAL, was deep in the Cascade Mountains seeking the absolute silence of the wilderness to heal his battle-worn soul. But the forest had other plans. A gaunt German shepherd suddenly emerged from the dense timber, not looking for food but desperately tugging at his gear. When the dog dropped a blood-stained military dog tag at his feet, Knox realized this was not a stray pet. It was a soldier on a mission of life or death. Someone was buried alive in the shadows of the peaks, and only this dog knew where. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The air in the Cascade Mountains held a sharp chill that could pierce right through standard clothing. Knox preferred it that way. He was in his early 30s, an active-duty Navy SEAL. He had short, cropped dark hair, piercing green eyes, and a lean, muscular build forged by years of punishing physical training. He wore a simple olive-drab fleece jacket and dark gray tactical cargo pants. He needed this total isolation. After a grueling deployment overseas, the absolute silence of the old-growth forest was the only thing that could recalibrate his mind. He had set up his small camp miles away from any designated hiking trails or tourist spots. There were no cell towers here and no internet connection. There was only the sound of wind rustling through the massive pine trees and the occasional distant call of a red-tailed hawk. Knox sat on a fallen log near his small, carefully constructed fire pit. He watched the flames lick the bottom of his blackened aluminum coffee pot. His movements were deliberate and highly efficient. Every item in his camp had a specific place. His tactical backpack rested against a tree stump, packed and ready to move at a moment's notice. This was a survival habit he could never break, because you never knew when you had to pack up and vanish. He poured the strong, bitter coffee into a metal mug and took a slow sip. The heat warmed his chest. He closed his eyes and let the tranquility wash over him. For the first time in months, his resting heart rate was at a normal pace. The hypervigilance that kept him alive in combat zones was slowly starting to fade into the background. But the forest has a way of changing its rhythm without any warning. A sudden snap of a dry branch echoed through the trees to his left. Knox opened his eyes. His body tensed instinctively. He did not move his head. He only shifted his green eyes toward the tree line to scan the dense underbrush. His right hand casually drifted down to rest near the survival knife strapped to his thigh. In these remote parts of the Cascades, a wandering black bear or a mountain lion was a very real possibility. He controlled his breathing and waited for the wind to shift so he could catch a scent or hear another sound. The woods had gone unnervingly quiet. Even the small birds in the canopy had stopped singing. Another rustle came from the bushes much closer this time. The thick green brush parted. It was not a bear. It was a dog. A German shepherd stumbled out from behind a large fern. The animal looked terrible. Its black and tan coat was matted with thick mud, sharp burrs, and pine needles. The dog was severely underweight, with its ribs clearly visible beneath its dirty fur. It stood there panting heavily, its tongue hanging out. Despite its exhausted state, the dog did not look feral. It had a thick, sturdy leather collar around its neck. Knox slowly took his hand away from his knife. He stayed seated on the log to make himself look much less threatening. He clicked his tongue softly. He expected the starving animal to immediately smell the beef jerky he had open in his supply bag. Most lost pets, driven by extreme hunger, would lose all caution at the scent of food. The German shepherd did not even glance at the open food bag. Its amber eyes were locked dead onto Knox. The dog let out a sharp bark. It was not an aggressive bark, but rather a demanding one. The dog paced 3 steps to the left and then 3 steps to the right, while keeping its focus entirely on the man sitting by the fire. Knox frowned. He had worked extensively with military working dogs during his time in the SEAL teams. He recognized the specific body language. This animal was not aimlessly wandering the woods. It was highly focused, and it was trying to communicate a specific need. "Hey, buddy," Knox said in a low, calm voice. "You look like you have been out here a long time. Come here, let me check your collar." He held out his hand, palm up. The German shepherd did not approach for a friendly pet. Instead, it ran forward and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Knox before barking twice right into his face. The dog then spun around and trotted a few yards back toward the dense forest from where it had emerged. It stopped to look over its shoulder at Knox. When Knox did not stand up immediately, the dog ran back to him. It grabbed the hem of Knox's cargo pants in its teeth and gave a firm, frantic tug. Knox stood up. The dog released his pants and backed away, letting out a low whine. It opened its mouth. Something small and metallic dropped from its jaws and landed on the soft dirt with a faint clink. Knox knelt down and picked up the object. The metal was freezing cold. He rubbed his thumb over the surface to clear away a smear of dark, dried crimson liquid. It was blood. Beneath the dried blood, Knox felt the familiar raised lettering stamped into the metal. It was a standard-issue military dog tag. Knox stared at the silver tag. The blood was relatively fresh and likely no more than a day old. The dog stood a few feet away, whining and pacing, while staring into the deep dark woods. The message was entirely unmistakable. Someone out there was badly hurt. Someone with military ties was in grave danger. And this loyal dog had run through miles of unforgiving wilderness to find help. The peaceful mountain vacation was officially over. Knox felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood his system. The hypervigilance he had been trying to suppress instantly snapped back into place. His mind shifted from civilian camper back to an active-duty Navy SEAL. He walked over to his campsite and kicked heavy dirt over the fire to extinguish it completely. He grabbed his tactical backpack and double-checked the side pouches for his trauma kit, high-powered flashlight, and extra paracord. He secured his knife and strapped the backpack tight against his shoulders, ensuring nothing would rattle or make noise while he moved. Knox turned to look at the German Shepherd. The dog was already waiting at the edge of the tree line with its posture tense and ready. "Show me the way," Knox commanded. The German Shepherd let out one short bark of understanding and darted into the thick undergrowth. Knox jogged right behind it, letting the dog lead him deeper into the dark, uncharted depths of the Cascade Forest. Knox followed the German Shepherd into the dense timber. The terrain immediately shifted from a mild slope to a punishing vertical climb. Thick roots jutted out from the soil like twisted veins, presenting constant trip hazards. The air grew thinner and colder as they ascended higher into the mountain range. The dog moved with a desperate but focused energy. It did not pause to sniff marking posts or chase small game that darted across their path. It only looked back every few minutes to ensure Knox was still trailing behind. Knox maintained a steady, punishing pace. His heavy tactical boots dug deep into the soft earth. He observed the animal closely as they climbed. A typical household pet would have collapsed from exhaustion by now, given the steep incline and lack of nutrition. This dog possessed a high level of endurance and structural discipline. It navigated the harsh landscape with tactical precision. Knox knew military working dogs were extensively trained to lead handlers to specific targets under extreme duress. This animal was operating on a deeply ingrained protocol, overriding its own physical suffering to complete a mission. They hiked continuously for a long stretch without a single water break. The canopy above grew so thick that the midday sun barely penetrated the overlapping branches. The shadows stretched long and dark across the damp forest floor. Knox began to notice subtle changes in the environment around him. His specialized training kicked in, shifting his mind into full operational mode. He stopped looking at the beautiful trees and started reading the dirt. The natural animal trails created by deer and elk began to fade away. In their place, he saw something that absolutely did not belong in this remote section of the Cascades. Deep, wide grooves were carved violently into the mud. Knox knelt on one knee to investigate. He brushed away a thick layer of fallen pine needles. He traced his gloved fingers over the heavy indentation. It was a tire track. It was not a standard off-road recreational vehicle track. The tread pattern was aggressive, blocky, and deeply recessed into the earth. It belonged to a heavy utility truck, the exact kind used for industrial hauling or covert military transport. Knox stood up slowly and scanned the surrounding perimeter. No civilian logging company or mining operation was authorized in this designated conservation sector. The presence of a heavy transport vehicle miles away from any paved road or legal logging trail was a massive warning sign. The German Shepherd let out a low, impatient whine and nudged Knox's calf with its nose. The dog wanted to keep moving forward. Knox nodded and adjusted his rifle sling over his shoulder. He drew his sidearm from his drop-leg tactical holster. He flipped the safety off with his thumb. His index finger rested perfectly straight along the trigger guard. He moved much slower now. His footsteps made zero sound on the damp forest floor as he rolled his weight from heel to toe. He treated the remainder of the hike like a hostile infiltration into enemy territory. The natural scent of pine and wet earth began to mix with something sharp and metallic. Knox flared his nostrils to pull in more of the scent. He recognized the distinct chemical smell instantly. It was cordite mixed with sulfur and industrial-grade ammonium nitrate. Someone had detonated high explosives very recently, and judging by the heavy acrid smell hanging in the damp air, they had used a significant amount of it. The unforgiving terrain finally leveled out onto a wide, rocky plateau. The trees cleared abruptly, revealing a sheer rock face that stretched vertically up toward the gray sky. The dog sprinted ahead and stopped at the base of the towering cliff. Knox remained in the tree line and observed the entire scene before stepping out of cover. The side of the mountain had been blown wide open. Massive boulders, shattered stone, and splintered wooden support beams were piled into a chaotic mountainous mound. A thick layer of gray, pulverized rock dust coated the surrounding vegetation like a dirty snowstorm. To an untrained eye, it looked like a catastrophic natural landslide. But Knox knew better. He analyzed the blast pattern. The debris was concentrated and directed inward rather than spilling outward. This was a highly controlled demolition, designed specifically to collapse a primary entry point. It was an old, forgotten mining tunnel. The large entrance was completely sealed off by thousands of tons of shattered rock and structural debris. The German Shepherd began to dig frantically at the solid base of the rubble. Its paws scraped violently against the jagged rocks. The dog completely ignored the sharp edges cutting into its footpads. It whined loudly and pushed its snout deep into a small, dark gap between two massive boulders. Knox stepped out of the protective tree line and quickly approached the collapsed mine. The chemical smell of explosives was overpowering here, burning the back of his throat. He holstered his weapon and knelt right beside the frantic dog. He placed his heavy hand firmly on the animal's back to calm it down. The dog stopped digging but kept its nose shoved into the dark crevice, its tail tucked low. Knox leaned his body in close to the jagged rocks. He placed his ear directly near the small gap in the debris. He closed his eyes and actively blocked out the ambient sound of the mountain wind rustling the pines behind him. He waited in total silence. Long seconds passed. Then he heard it. A faint, raspy sound echoed from deep within the pitch-black, collapsed tunnel. It was a human voice. The voice let out a weak, ragged moan of pure agony. Someone was buried alive under thousands of pounds of stone. Knox immediately unclipped his heavy tactical backpack and let it hit the dirt. He unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a high-lumen tactical flashlight. He clicked the rubberized button on the tail cap. The powerful blinding beam pierced the absolute darkness inside the narrow crevice. Thick dust particles danced wildly in the harsh white light. The gap was terribly narrow, but it went deep into the mountain's belly. Knox realized the explosive charge had successfully brought down the main archway, but the inner wooden support beams might still be holding up a small, fragile pocket of air. The person trapped inside was not crushed immediately by the initial blast, but their oxygen supply was ticking down rapidly in that sealed tomb, and the structural integrity of the remaining rubble was completely compromised. One wrong move or shifting rock could easily trigger a secondary collapse and crush them both instantly. Knox knew he had to act fast and rely on his extraction training. He turned his head to look at the German Shepherd. The dog looked up at him with highly intelligent and desperate eyes, waiting for a command. Knox reached deep into his pack and pulled out a heavy-duty steel pry bar. He was going in. Knox gripped his heavy-duty steel pry bar and slid his upper body into the narrow, dark opening. The air inside the collapsed tunnel was immediately thicker, choked with pulverized rock dust and the lingering chemical burn of ammonium nitrate. He kept his high-lumen tactical flashlight mounted to his shoulder strap to keep both hands free. He army-crawled over jagged slabs of shattered granite. The space was incredibly tight. The jagged ceiling scraped against the tough fabric of his tactical backpack. He had to exhale completely, just to squeeze his broad shoulders through the narrowest pinch points. The German Shepherd followed right behind him, wiggling through the rubble with surprising agility despite its clear exhaustion. Knox moved carefully. He tested every rock before putting his full weight on it. The structural integrity of the tunnel was completely gone. One wrong shift could bring thousands of tons of stone crashing down on both of them. After crawling a long distance through the tight passage, the tunnel opened up slightly into a small, fragile pocket of air supported by a single splintered wooden beam. Knox swept his flashlight across the grim scene. The beam illuminated a man trapped beneath a massive fallen support timber and a pile of heavy rocks. The German Shepherd immediately pushed past Knox and let out a frantic whine. The dog began licking the trapped man's face. Knox crawled forward and assessed the situation. The victim was an older man, likely in his late 60s. He had a weathered face lined with deep wrinkles, short silver hair covered in gray dust, and he wore a faded olive-green military surplus jacket. The man was barely conscious. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid jerks. The heavy wooden beam had pinned his right leg completely, crushing it against the hard stone floor. Knox went to work immediately. He slipped off his tactical backpack and pulled out his trauma kit. He unzipped the red pouch, organizing his life-saving supplies by touch in the dim light. "Stay with me," Knox said in a firm, calm voice. He checked the man's pulse. It was weak and racing. The thick dust in the air made it incredibly difficult to breathe. Knox leaned in close to inspect the trapped leg. Blood was pooling fast around the crushed limb, soaking into the dry dirt. An arterial bleed. Knox knew he had less than a minute before the blood loss became fatal. He pulled a heavy-duty combat tourniquet from his kit. He slid it high up on the man's right thigh, well above the crush injury. He twisted the windlass rod hard, locking it into place. The older man let out a sharp gasp of pain as the bleeding finally slowed and stopped. Knox then pulled out a compression bandage and packed it tightly around the visible wounds to prevent infection and further blood loss. The older man blinked his eyes open slowly. He squinted against the harsh glare of Knox's flashlight. His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out at first. The German Shepherd nudged his hand gently. The man managed a weak smile for his loyal dog before looking back at Knox. You actually found me," the man whispered. His voice was raspy from inhaling so much rock dust. Knox offered him a canteen of water. The man took a small sip and coughed violently. "My name is Knox," Knox said, keeping his tone level. "I'm an active-duty Navy SEAL. Your dog led me right to you. What is your name?" The man swallowed hard and took a deep breath. "Harlan," he replied. "Served in the Marines, 1st Recon, a long time ago." Knox nodded with a deep sense of mutual respect. "Well, Harlan, you trained your dog well. Now we need to get this beam off your leg before the rest of the ceiling decides to give way." Knox positioned his steel pry bar under the edge of the massive timber. He needed to find a solid fulcrum point to leverage the weight off Harlan's trapped leg. The wooden beam easily weighed several hundred pounds, and it was wedged tightly beneath a jagged boulder. Knox shoved a medium-sized rock under the pry bar and threw his entire body weight onto the opposite end. The heavy timber groaned loudly. Dust rained down from the fragile ceiling above them. The beam lifted a small distance. It was not nearly enough. Knox adjusted his grip and prepared to try again. But Harlan reached out a trembling, dust-covered hand and grabbed Knox by the wrist. The grip was surprisingly strong for a man in his condition. Harlan shook his head slowly. His eyes were wide and filled with a sudden, intense urgency. "Do not move it," Harlan wheezed, his voice straining with effort. "If you move that beam, the boulder above it will drop. The whole ceiling will come down on us." Knox paused and followed Harlan's gaze upward. The older veteran was absolutely right. The entire structural weight of the remaining tunnel ceiling was resting precariously on that single pinned out timber. Removing it would trigger a massive, fatal cave-in. Knox let go of the pry bar and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "All right," Knox said. "I will stabilize the ceiling first, then we dig you out." "How did this happen, Harlan? Was it a natural collapse?" Harlan let out a bitter, humorless laugh that quickly turned into a wet cough. The German shepherd whined softly and rested its head on Harlan's chest. "Natural," Harlan whispered. "Far from it, son. This was no accident. They tried to bury me alive." Knox narrowed his eyes. The chemical smell of explosives in the air already told him this was a deliberate demolition. But attempted murder was a completely different level of escalation. "Who is they?" Knox asked quietly. His hand instinctively drifted toward the sidearm holstered on his thigh. Harlan struggled to speak, his breathing becoming more labored. "I was tracking a group of illegal loggers," Harlan explained. "Thought they were just cutting down protected timber, but I followed their heavy trucks up here. They were not logging. They were using this old mine as a staging ground, a storage facility." Harlan paused to take another sip of water from Knox's canteen. "I got too close," he continued. "I saw what they were unloading from those trucks. Military crates, high-grade weapons, hundreds of them. They spotted me in the tree line, chased me into the tunnel. When they realized they could not catch me in the dark, they just blew the main entrance and sealed me inside." Knox processed the information with cold tactical precision. A few months prior, there had been a major breach at a regional National Guard armory. A massive shipment of assault rifles, tactical explosives, and body armor had vanished without a single trace. The authorities assumed the weapons had already been smuggled across the border. But they were wrong. The weapons were sitting right here in the remote Cascade Mountains, and the people guarding them were heavily armed, highly organized, and completely willing to murder an old man to protect their stash. Knox looked at Harlan. "We need to get you out of here right now," Knox said. "If they blew this entrance, they will eventually come back to confirm the kill." As if on cue, the German shepherd's ears suddenly pinned flat against its skull. The dog stood up and faced the dark, narrow crevice they had just crawled through. The fur on the back of its neck stood straight up. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in the dog's chest. Knox instantly clicked off his flashlight, plunging the fragile air pocket into absolute pitch-black darkness. Faintly, through the solid rock, he heard the distinct crunch of heavy boots marching across the loose gravel outside. Knox kept his hand firmly over the German shepherd's muzzle. He applied just enough pressure to silence the low rumble, vibrating in the animal's throat. The pitch-black darkness of the collapsed tunnel was absolute. Without the harsh glare of his tactical flashlight, the space felt even smaller and far more suffocating. The thick rock dust settled on his skin like a heavy blanket. The air was stale, chemical-heavy, and incredibly difficult to breathe. Beside him, Harlan let out a slow, ragged breath. Knox squeezed the older veteran's shoulder in the dark. It was a silent command to stay completely still. Outside the narrow crevice they had crawled through, the sound of heavy boots crunching on loose gravel grew louder and more distinct. Someone was walking deliberately around the blast zone. Knox leaned his head close to Harlan. "How many men did you see before they blew the tunnel?" Knox whispered, his voice barely a breath against the cold stone. Harlan swallowed hard, trying to clear the dust from his dry throat. "Several men. They were heavily armed and highly organized. They drove 2 massive surplus transport trucks right up the old logging road. I watched them from the tree line. They were unloading large olive-drab crates, standard military issue. I recognized the distinct markings and the specific locking mechanisms from my active duty days. They were moving high-explosive munitions, modern assault rifles, and heavy body armor into the mine. It was enough hardware to supply a small army and completely destabilize a region." Knox processed this information rapidly. A few months prior, the Regional Command Center had issued a classified alert briefing. A major National Guard armory had been compromised in the middle of the night. A massive cache of military-grade weapons and explosives had vanished without a single trace. The entire tactical community assumed the stolen armaments were already gone, shipped far across the border to international buyers. Absolutely no one suspected the cache was sitting right here. hidden deep inside an abandoned mining tunnel in the remote Cascade Mountains. They are using this isolated location as a staging ground, Knox whispered back, his mind working quickly through the tactical implications. They bring the stolen shipments up here, hide them deep in the mountain, and distribute them to buyers quietly over time. The operation is completely off the grid. You stumbled right into their central vault. I was just tracking illegal loggers, Harlan rasped, shifting his weight slightly and wincing as a sharp pain shot up his pinned leg. I thought I was dealing with men stealing timber, but when I saw those crates, I knew I was in way over my head. I tried to back out quietly. My dog stepped on a dry branch. The snap echoed like a gunshot in the silent forest. They opened fire immediately. I ran into the tunnel to take cover. They did not chase me inside. They just rigged the entrance with C4 and brought the mountain down on top of me. The loud crunch of heavy boots stopped right outside the narrow gap in the rubble. Knox moved his hand from the dog's muzzle directly to the grip of his sidearm. He drew the weapon smoothly and silently from his drop-leg holster. He kept his index finger resting perfectly straight along the trigger guard. He positioned his muscular body directly between the narrow opening and Harlan. If the men outside decided to clear the rubble, Knox would have a massive tactical bottleneck advantage. He could take them out one by one as they tried to squeeze through the tight rocks. But if they simply tossed a fragmentation grenade into the gap, Knox, Harlan, and the brave German shepherd would be killed instantly. A bright beam of light suddenly pierced the dark crevice. The harsh white light cut rapidly through the floating dust particles, scanning the jagged rocks. Knox pressed his back flat against the cold stone wall, staying completely out of the beam's direct path. He squinted his green eyes through a small gap between two large boulders. He could clearly see portions of the men standing outside. Two figures stood near the collapsed entrance. The first man was tall and heavily built, wearing a black tactical vest over a gray long-sleeve shirt. He had a thick, jagged scar running along his jawline. He held a high-powered flashlight in his left hand and a modern assault rifle in his right. The second man was shorter but visibly muscular and wired with nervous energy, wearing a dark green canvas jacket and carrying a heavy steel crowbar. The blast completely sealed the main archway, the tall, scarred man said. His voice was deep and lacked any trace of emotion. There is no way the old man survived that collapse. Thousands of tons of solid rock came down right on top of him. The boss wants a visual confirmation, the shorter man replied, kicking a loose stone with his heavy steel-toed boot. He said the old guy saw the armory crates. We cannot afford any loose ends on this operation. If he is still breathing in there, he could eventually signal for help. We need to find the body and make sure. Are you crazy? The tall man scoffed, shining his light deeper into the jagged rocks. Look at this mess. The structural integrity is completely gone. If we start moving these boulders to dig them out, the rest of the ceiling will cave in. We would be crushed instantly. Inside the dark pocket, the German shepherd shifted its weight. The dog's natural survival instincts were fighting hard against its intense training. It could smell the men who had hurt its owner. It desperately wanted to protect Harlan. Knox felt the animal's muscles bunch up tight under his hand. He tightened his grip on the dog's heavy leather collar. He needed absolute silence right now. If the men outside heard a single sound, they would know their target was still alive. They would not hesitate to finish the job immediately. We drop another charge, the shorter man suggested outside, his voice echoing slightly in the confined rocky space. We pack the crevice with a few blocks of C4 and blow it again. That will vaporize whatever is left of him and permanently seal the vault. The boss gets his confirmation. We do not have to dig through this heavy dirt, and we secure the weapons cache completely. Knox felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit his system. A secondary explosion in this confined space would be absolutely devastating. It would instantly shatter the single wooden beam holding up the ceiling above Harlan. The resulting shockwave would completely collapse their fragile air pocket and crush all three of them under tons of solid granite. He had to make a move immediately. He could not sit in the dark and wait for them to rig the explosives. He needed to eliminate the immediate threat and secure a safe path out of the mountain. Knox turned his attention back to Harlan. The older veteran was listening intently to the conversation outside. His face was deathly pale beneath the thick layer of gray rock dust. His breathing was growing shallower by the minute, due to the crushing weight on his leg and the massive blood loss. "They're going to blow the tunnel again," Harlan whispered, gripping Knox by the sleeve. "You have to leave me here. Take my dog and crawl out the back way. There has to be a ventilation shaft further down. You cannot fight an entire heavily armed crew by yourself." "I am not leaving anyone behind," Knox replied quietly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "I am an active-duty Navy SEAL. We do not abandon our own." He checked the magazine of his sidearm entirely by touch, feeling the brass casings under his thumb. It was fully loaded. He looked over at the German Shepherd. "You stay here and guard him," Knox commanded the dog in a silent but firm hand gesture. He hoped the highly trained animal could see his movement in the faint ambient light bouncing from the flashlight outside. The German Shepherd seemed to understand the gravity of the situation perfectly. It laid down right next to Harlan, keeping its warm body pressed tightly against the injured man, ready to protect its owner at all costs. Knox holstered his sidearm and pulled his combat knife from his thigh sheath. A gunshot would echo for miles and alert the rest of the heavily armed crew waiting at the transport trucks. He needed to handle this quietly. He laid flat on his stomach and began the slow, agonizing crawl back through the narrow crevice. The jagged rocks tore at his tactical clothing. The thick dust filled his lungs, but he forced himself not to cough. He moved inch by inch, timing his movements carefully with the sound of the men talking outside. He pushed himself closer to the harsh beam of light, preparing to step out of the darkness and engage the enemy. Knox squeezed his broad shoulders through the final narrow gap of the collapsed rock wall. He emerged back into the main tunnel corridor, leaving Harlan safely tucked in the fragile air pocket behind him. The air in this outer section was slightly less suffocating, but the darkness remained absolute. He stayed low to the uneven ground. His tactical boots made zero sound against the loose gravel. He needed to turn this enclosed space into his own personal battlefield. He reached into his tactical thigh pocket and pulled out a long spool of military-grade green paracord. He moved quickly and silently toward the main entrance area where the blast had occurred. The beams of light from the men outside were still searching the jagged rocks. Knox found two sturdy wooden support beams that had miraculously survived the initial explosion. He tied the paracord tight across the narrow walkway about shin-high. It was a simple tripwire, but highly effective in the pitch-black environment. He tested the tension with 2 fingers and nodded to himself. The German Shepherd slipped through the crevice right behind him. The dog moved like a phantom in the dark. Knox looked at the animal and gave a swift downward motion with his flat hand. The dog instantly dropped its belly flat to the dirt. It did not make a single sound or pant heavily despite the thick dust. Knox was amazed by the discipline. This was not just a loyal pet trying to find its master. This was a highly trained working dog operating flawlessly in a high-stress combat scenario. The dog kept its amber eyes locked on Knox, waiting for the next command. "We need to clear these rocks right now," the tall, scarred man ordered from the other side of the rubble. His heavy boots crunched loudly as he stepped over the debris. "Bring the crowbar. Start prying those top boulders loose so we can see inside." The shorter, muscular man grumbled a harsh response. He stepped into the tunnel first. He held his high-powered flashlight in his left hand and the heavy steel crowbar in his right. He swept the light back and forth, but the thick dust suspended in the air reflected the beam and reduced his visibility significantly. He took 3 heavy, impatient steps forward. His heavy boot caught the taut paracord wire. The man stumbled forward with a loud shout. He dropped his flashlight as he threw his hands out instinctively to break his fall. His heavy body hit the rocky floor hard. The flashlight rolled away and pointed its beam uselessly against the tunnel wall, casting long, strange shadows across the cavern. Knox did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He lunged forward from the deep shadows like a coiled spring. He clamped his left hand firmly over the fallen man's mouth to muffle any scream. With his right hand, he delivered a precise, calculated strike to the side of the man's neck, targeting the carotid artery. The shorter man went completely limp instantly. Knox dragged his unconscious body quietly into the darkness behind a massive fallen boulder. He quickly stripped the man of his tactical radio, a spare magazine of ammunition, and a heavy combat knife.
"Hey,"
the tall, scarred man called out from the entrance.
"Did you trip? Where is your light?"
The tall man stepped cautiously into the tunnel. He raised his modern assault rifle and clicked on the weapon-mounted tactical light. The bright beam cut through the dust and illuminated the empty space where his partner had just fallen. The tripped paracord was now clearly visible. He swept the rifle barrel left and right. His finger tightened on the trigger. He sensed something was terribly wrong and that they were no longer alone in the dark. Knox was pressed flat against the cold rock wall, holding his breath. The rifle beam passed mere inches from his face, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. He needed a distraction to break the man's line of sight. He looked across the tunnel at the German shepherd hiding perfectly still in the shadows. Knox made a quick circling motion with his index finger and pointed toward a pile of loose gravel on the opposite side of the tunnel. The dog understood the silent command immediately. It scrambled silently across the dirt and used its front paws to push a small cascade of rocks down a steep slope. The rocks clattered loudly in the otherwise silent tunnel, echoing off the stone walls. The tall man instantly whipped his rifle toward the sound.
"Who is there?"
he yelled into the dark. He fired a single warning shot into the shadows. The loud crack of the rifle echoed deafeningly in the confined space, ringing in Knox's ears. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the entire cavern. The shot provided the exact opening Knox needed to close the distance. He pushed off the wall and sprinted across the short rocky expanse. He tackled the tall man directly at the waist. The heavy impact drove the breath from the man's lungs with a loud grunt. The assault rifle clattered out of his hands and slid far across the gravel floor, out of reach. The two men grappled violently in the dark. The tall man was incredibly strong and heavily muscled, fighting with desperate ferocity. He threw a wild punch that grazed Knox's jaw. Knox absorbed the hit and twisted his body, using his momentum against his opponent. He locked his arm around the man's neck in a tight chokehold. The man thrashed and kicked violently, trying to break free from the iron grip. The intense struggle kicked up thick clouds of choking rock dust, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Knox knew that every second spent wrestling in the dirt increased the risk of the tunnel collapsing. The tall man clawed desperately at Knox's arm, his thick fingers trying to find a weak point in the hold. Knox shifted his weight, pinning the man's legs with his own body to prevent him from reaching for a secondary weapon. The tactical training ingrained in Knox over years of arduous deployments took complete control. He remained entirely calm amidst the chaos, his breathing controlled despite the thick layer of dust coating his throat. He applied just the right amount of pressure to the carotid artery, cutting off the blood flow to the man's brain. Within seconds, the tall man's violent thrashing began to slow down. His heavy arms dropped to his sides, and his body went entirely limp against the cold stone floor. Knox carefully released the hold and rolled away, instantly scanning the environment for the next immediate threat. That was when a third man appeared at the entrance. The new arrival from the transport trucks was a thin man with a shaved head wearing a dark gray tactical jacket. He had rushed up the trail after hearing the warning shot. He held a heavy pump-action shotgun tight against his shoulder. He saw the two men rolling on the ground in the dim ambient light of the dropped flashlights.
"Stop moving or I will shoot,"
the third man shouted, racking the shotgun loudly. Knox could not reach his weapon without giving the man a clear target. He was completely exposed to the newcomer. Before the third man could pull the shotgun trigger, a dark blur launched from the shadows. The German shepherd leaped through the air with terrifying speed and precision. The dog clamped its powerful jaws directly onto the third man's forearm, holding the weapon. The man screamed in sudden pain and dropped the shotgun. The weapon hit the rocky ground and discharged accidentally. The loud boom of the shotgun blast ripped through the tunnel. The heavy buckshot slammed into a wooden support beam right above them. The ancient timber splintered violently, sending shards of wood everywhere. A shower of sharp rock fragments rained down on the combatants. The structural integrity of the entire tunnel area groaned ominously, echoing deep into the mountain. The fight was far from over, and the mountain itself was now threatening to bury them all permanently. The deafening roar of the shotgun blast bounced off the solid stone wall The sound physically hit Knox in the chest. A shower of splinters and sharp gravel rained down on his head and shoulders. The third man was still screaming in the dark. The German Shepherd had locked its jaws firmly around the man's forearm. The dog pulled backward with incredible force. The man thrashed on the ground trying to shake the heavy animal loose. Knox knew this chaos would attract the rest of the smuggling crew immediately. He scrambled across the uneven floor on his hands and knees. He reached the tall man he had choked out moments ago. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the dropped assault rifle. He grabbed it and checked the magazine. It was full. He flipped the selector switch from safe to semi-automatic. "Release!" Knox commanded in a sharp, clear voice. The German Shepherd let go of the screaming man instantly. The dog bounded back into the shadows and vanished. Knox stepped forward and delivered a swift kick to the wounded man's head. The man went limp and silent. Knox dragged the unconscious body behind a large pile of mining equipment. 3 men were down, but Harlan had counted several. That meant more heavily armed individuals were rushing up the mountain trail right now. Knox retreated to the narrowest section of the tunnel. He positioned himself behind a rusted ore cart that had been abandoned decades ago. This spot gave him a clear line of sight to the main entrance, while providing solid cover from incoming fire. He was perfectly positioned to protect the small crevice where Harlan was trapped. Footsteps pounded outside the collapsed entrance. 2 bright beams of light cut through the settling dust. A new voice echoed into the cavern. It was sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of panic. "Report," the voice demanded. Nobody answered. The 2 men stepped cautiously over the rubble and entered the tunnel. They moved with military precision. They kept their weapons raised and swept their lights in overlapping arcs. A third figure followed closely behind them. This man was clearly the leader. He was in his late 50s with short silver hair and cold pale eyes. He wore a dark gray heavy coat and carried a compact submachine gun with a high-capacity magazine. His face was set in a hard, grim line. He surveyed the scene quickly. He saw the tripped wire. He saw the missing men. He understood the situation immediately. "We have a hostile in the tunnel," the leader announced calmly. "Spread out. Use the boulders for cover. Watch your corners." Knox rested the barrel of his captured rifle on the edge of the rusted cart. He controlled his breathing. He waited for the 2-point men to move deeper into the kill zone. The thick dust in the air made it difficult for them to see far ahead. Knox had the advantage of knowing the terrain. The man on the left moved past a large support pillar. Knox squeezed the trigger twice. The sharp cracks of the rifle filled the tunnel. The man dropped his flashlight and crumpled to the ground, holding his shoulder. The leader and the remaining man instantly returned fire. A hail of bullets slammed into the rusted ore cart. Sparks flew everywhere as lead hit thick steel. The noise was absolutely deafening. Knox kept his head down. He could feel the shockwaves vibrating through his teeth. The continuous gunfire had a devastating effect on the fragile tunnel structure. The air filled with a terrifying grinding sound. Thousands of tons of rock above them were shifting. Heavy chunks of ceiling began to break off and crash to the floor. "Hold your fire!" the leader yelled over the noise. "You are going to bring the whole mountain down on us." The shooting stopped. A heavy silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the sound of falling pebbles and the groans of the wounded man. The air was so thick with dust that Knox could barely see far in front of him. He knew the leader was repositioning in the dark. These men were well trained. They were using tactical flanking maneuvers. Knox slowly peeked around the side of the cart. He saw a shadow moving silently along the right wall. He raised his rifle, but a sudden shower of rocks fell directly in front of him, blocking his shot. "Knox!" Harlan yelled weakly from the dark crevice behind him. "The support beams are cracking. You have to finish this now." Knox knew Harlan was right. The tunnel could not withstand another heavy exchange of gunfire. He needed to eliminate the leader and get Harlan out before the ceiling gave way completely. He pulled the spare magazine he had taken from the unconscious man. He tossed it hard toward the left side of the tunnel. The heavy metal magazine clattered loudly against the stone wall. The remaining point man reacted instantly. He swung his light and his weapon toward the noise. He fired a 3-round burst into the empty shadows. The muzzle flash revealed his exact position. Knox stepped out from behind the cart and fired a single precise shot. The point man fell backward and did not move. Only the leader remained. Knox scanned the dark cavern. He could not see the man anywhere. The leader had used the brief distraction to slip into a blind spot. Knox moved slowly away from the cart. He kept his back against the solid rock wall. He swept his rifle barrel left and right. Every shadow looked like a threat. The grinding sound above grew louder. Time was running out. Suddenly, the beam of a flashlight hit Knox directly in the eyes. It blinded him instantly. He heard the distinct click of a submachine gun bolt sliding into place. The leader had flanked him perfectly. The older man was standing less than 20 feet away on top of a pile of rubble. He had a clear, unobstructed shot at Knox.
Drop the weapon,
the leader commanded. His voice was cold and steady. Knox could not see the man through the blinding light. He knew if he moved to aim his rifle, the leader would fire a barrage of bullets. He tightened his grip on his weapon. He prepared to dive to the side and take his chances. Before the leader could pull the trigger, a dark shape launched itself from the top of an adjacent boulder. The German Shepherd had climbed high into the rocks during the firefight. The dog soared through the air in a massive leap. It crashed directly into the leader's chest. The impact knocked the man backward. The flashlight flew out of his hand and shattered against the wall. The dog clamped its jaws viciously onto the leader's right arm. The man screamed in pain and terror. He fell onto his back in the dirt. He squeezed the trigger of his submachine gun in a blind panic. The weapon fired a continuous wild burst into the darkness. The bullet slammed directly into the last remaining wooden support pillar, holding up the central tunnel ceiling. The heavy timbers splintered and snapped perfectly in half. A sound like a massive thunderclap shook the entire mountain. The ground beneath their feet heaved violently. The tunnel was officially collapsing. The massive thunderclap of the breaking support timber vibrated through every single bone in Knox's body. The structural collapse was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. The cavern ceiling directly above the leader gave way entirely. A massive slab of solid granite weighing several tons slammed into the tunnel floor. The impact kicked up a blinding cloud of pulverized rock and completely buried the leader along with his weapon. Knox did not waste a single second watching the thick dust settle. He turned his back on the carnage and sprinted through the absolute darkness toward the narrow crevice where Harlan was trapped. The ground beneath his heavy tactical boots bucked and heaved like the wooden deck of a ship caught in a violent storm. The air pressure inside the mine shifted drastically. A fierce wind whipped through the tunnels as tons of falling rock displaced the stagnant air. Knox dove headfirst into the small opening. He scraped his broad shoulders against the jagged rock edges, but ignored the sharp sting of his torn skin. He found Harlan right where he had left him. The older veteran was covered in a fresh layer of gray dust and coughing weakly into his hand. The German Shepherd had already scrambled back through the opening and was whining frantically while licking Harlan's pale face. "We are leaving right now," Knox stated firmly. His deep voice cut easily through the deafening roar of the collapsing mountain. He reached into his medical kit purely by touch and grabbed a heavy dose of combat-grade painkillers. He injected the medication directly into Harlan's thigh right above the tightened tourniquet. "This will take the edge off the pain, but you absolutely need to stay conscious. The main entrance is completely gone. We are finding another way out right now." Knox wrapped Harlan's left arm tightly over his own broad shoulders. He grabbed the older man by the thick fabric of his military surplus jacket and hauled him upright in one fluid motion. Harlan let out a sharp cry of raw agony as his crushed right leg shifted, but the powerful painkillers were already starting to dull the worst of the severe medical shock. Knox supported almost all of Harlan's body weight. They moved awkwardly but quickly deeper into the abandoned mine. The German Shepherd took the lead without ever needing a spoken command. The highly trained dog kept its wet nose close to the ground and navigated the pitch-black tunnels with pure survival instinct. Knox kept his tactical flashlight pointed forward. The bright white beam of light bounced wildly as they stumbled over uneven terrain and rusted old mining debris. The noise behind them was absolutely terrifying. It sounded exactly like the entire mountain was being fed into a giant industrial stone crusher. The cave-in was not localized anymore. The initial shockwave from the massive ceiling failure was actively triggering a severe chain reaction throughout the entire underground network. Huge sections of solid rock crashed down into the exact corridors they had just traversed. Dust billowed past them in thick, choking waves, making visibility nearly zero. Knox realized they were rapidly running out of breathable oxygen. His lungs burned fiercely with every single heavy breath he took. Harlan's head was starting to slump forward, uncontrollably. The older veteran was rapidly losing the grim battle against severe blood loss and total physical exhaustion. "Look at the dog," Harlan mumbled weakly. His rough chin rested heavily on Knox's shoulder. Knox forced his watering eyes to focus through the blinding rock dust. The German shepherd had completely stopped at the dead end of the long stone corridor. The dog was standing upright on its hind legs with its front paws resting high against the cold stone wall. It was barking loudly upward. Knox moved his tactical flashlight beam straight up the wall. About 5 feet above the rocky floor, he finally saw it. A square metal grate covering a vertical ventilation shaft. The rusted iron metal was bent and ancient, but Knox could actually feel a faint draft of fresh cold air pulling steadily through the small gaps. "That is our exit right there," Knox yelled over the continuous grinding roar of the dying mountain. He dragged Harlan directly to the base of the stone wall and gently lowered him down to the ground. Knox jumped up and grabbed the rusted metal grate securely with both of his hands. He planted his heavy boots flat against the stone wall and pulled backward with every single ounce of strength in his muscular frame. The ancient iron bolt screamed in loud metallic protest before snapping completely in half. The heavy metal grate tore free and clattered loudly onto the rocky floor. The dark shaft was extremely narrow and lined with jagged rock, but it angled sharply upward directly toward the surface of the mountain. Knox picked up the heavy German shepherd first. The large dog did not struggle at all during the process. It allowed Knox to hoist its body high up into the opening. The dog scrambled frantically up the steep rocky incline and quickly disappeared into the dark vertical shaft. Now came the hardest part of the escape. Knox knelt right beside Harlan. "I am going to push you up," Knox said, looking directly into the older man's fading eyes. "You have to use your good leg and pull hard with your arms. I will be right behind you the entire way." Harlan simply nodded his head. Knox lifted the heavy veteran right off the floor and shoved him headfirst into the dark ventilation shaft. Harlan gritted his teeth and dragged his broken body upward using his elbows and his single uninjured leg. Knox climbed into the shaft right behind him. He placed his hands firmly against the rubber soles of Harlan's boots and pushed upward with his powerful leg muscles. The tunnel directly behind them finally gave way completely. A massive wall of solid rock crashed into the exact space they had occupied just seconds ago. The sheer force of the total collapse pushed a violent blast of dead air and thick dust rapidly up the narrow shaft. Knox completely ignored the deafening noise and the raining sharp pebbles. He kept pushing Harlan higher and higher through the tight dark stone chimney. He could suddenly see a circle of gray daylight shining brightly above them. The German shepherd was barking wildly from the top of the open hole. Knox summoned the absolute last reserves of his physical energy. He locked his elbows and gave one final massive upward heave. Harlan tumbled out of the hole and onto the soft damp earth of the green forest floor. Knox immediately scrambled up over the rocky edge right behind him. He collapsed onto the wet pine needles, just as the ground beneath them shuddered violently one last time. The old ventilation shaft imploded with a deep, muffled roar, sealing the underground tomb forever. They were finally outside. They were alive. The cold mountain rain began to fall, just as the last deep rumble of the collapsing mine faded into the earth. Knox lay flat on his back on the damp pine needles, taking in massive gulps of fresh air. Every muscle in his body burned with severe exhaustion. Beside him, Harlan was slipping in and out of consciousness. The older veteran was incredibly pale, and his breathing was alarmingly shallow. The German shepherd stood vigilantly over its owner, whining softly and nudging Harlan's hand with its wet nose. Knox knew they were out of the immediate danger of the cave-in, but Harlan was rapidly running out of time. Knox rolled onto his side and reached into his tactical cargo pocket. He pulled out the heavy black two-way radio he had confiscated from the smuggler he had knocked out in the tunnel. He turned the volume dial all the way up and switched the channel frequency off the encrypted smuggling network. He tuned it directly to the universal emergency broadcast frequency used by regional search and rescue teams. He pressed the thick rubber transmission button on the side of the radio. "Mayday, Mayday. This is an active-duty Navy SEAL requesting immediate medical evacuation. I have a critical casualty with severe crush injuries and massive blood loss. We are located several miles north of the abandoned Copper Creek logging road on the upper ridgeline. We need a medevac chopper right now." Static hissed violently over the speaker for several seconds. Then a clear and professional voice broke through the noise. It was a dispatcher from the Regional Air Rescue Command Center. "Copy your Mayday. We have a rescue bird already airborne in your sector. They are adjusting their flight path to your coordinates right now. Estimated time of arrival is soon. Keep your casualty stable and pop smoke if you have it." Knox confirmed the transmission and clipped the radio back onto his belt. Soon was a lifetime for a man in Harlan's critical condition, but it was the best they could get. Knox opened his trauma kit one last time and checked the tight combat tourniquet on Harlan's leg. It was holding steady, but the surrounding tissue damage was extensive. He took off his thick olive-drab fleece jacket and draped it over the older man's shaking torso to prevent severe hypothermia from the freezing rain. The distinct chopping sound of heavy rotor blades soon echoed over the dense forest canopy. A large red and white search and rescue helicopter crested the tree line. The powerful downwash from the blades whipped the tall pine trees violently and sent loose leaves flying everywhere. Knox stood up and waved his bright red medical pouch in the air to mark their exact location. The helicopter hovered expertly above a small natural clearing just a short distance away. A rescue basket was lowered quickly to the ground, followed by two highly trained flight medics wearing bright orange jumpsuits. The medics rushed over to their position carrying heavy trauma bags. They immediately assessed Harlan's crushed leg and started an intravenous line of fluid replacement. They secured the older veteran tightly into a rigid spine board and loaded him into the metal rescue basket. The German Shepherd barked anxiously as its owner was lifted high into the air toward the hovering aircraft. Knox grabbed the dog firmly by its heavy leather collar to prevent it from chasing the basket. The dog pulled against the restraint, but eventually sat down, watching the helicopter pull Harlan up to safety. A thick steel cable then dropped down for Knox. He secured the dog tightly against his chest using his tactical climbing harness. They were hoisted up together into the noisy cabin of the rescue chopper. The aircraft banked sharply and sped away toward the nearest major trauma center. Days later, the bright morning sun streamed freely through the large window of the military hospital recovery wing. Knox walked quietly down the pristine white hallway wearing a clean pair of civilian clothes. He stopped outside a room in the recovery wing and knocked twice on the open door. Harlan was sitting upright in a specialized medical wheelchair looking out the window at the busy hospital courtyard. His right leg was heavily bandaged and elevated on a padded rest. The surgeons had managed to save his limb, but his days of hiking rugged mountain trails were permanently over. "You look a lot better than the last time I saw you," Knox said, stepping into the bright room. Harlan turned his head and offered a genuine warm smile. His face had regained its color, and his eyes were sharp and clear again. "I feel a lot better," Harlan replied, extending his hand. Knox walked over and shook the older veteran's hand firmly. "The doctors told me I am going to have a very long physical therapy road ahead of me, but I am alive, and that is entirely because of you." "It was a joint effort," Knox said, leaning against the wall. "Your dog did most of the hard work finding me in the first place." Harlan chuckled softly. "The federal agents came by to see me yesterday. They took a very long official statement. They told me you gave them the exact coordinates of the smuggling ring transport trucks. The tactical response team rounded up the entire crew before they could even pack up their gear and run. They recovered every single piece of stolen military hardware from the transport vehicles. The operation is completely dismantled." "That is good news," Knox nodded. "They picked the wrong mountain to hide their stolen gear." A heavy silence fell over the hospital room for a moment. Harlan looked down at his bandaged leg and took a deep breath. His expression turned incredibly serious. He wheeled his chair slightly closer to where Knox was standing. "I have a massive favor to ask you," Harlan said quietly. "My dog is currently sitting in a temporary holding kennel downstairs. They have been taking good care of him, but he hates being locked up in a cage. He is a highly active and incredibly smart animal. He needs open space. He needs to run, and he needs a job to do. I'm going to be stuck in this wheelchair for months. and even when I walk again, I will never be able to keep up with him." Knox looked at the older man and understood exactly what was coming next. He thought about the incredible bravery and raw intelligence the German Shepherd had displayed in the dark, collapsing tunnel. The animal had practically operated like a fellow SEAL team member. "I want you to take him," Harlan said, looking directly into Knox's eyes. "I saw the way you two worked together in that mine. He completely trusted you. You are a brave and capable soldier. You are exactly the kind of leader he needs to follow. Will you adopt him?" Knox did not need to think about the decision. He had lived a solitary life for a very long time, moving from one intense deployment to the next. But the fierce loyalty he had witnessed on that mountain had changed his perspective entirely. He realized that having a partner like that by his side would make the quiet times much better. "It would be an absolute honor to take him," Knox said with a firm nod. "I promise you he will have a great life. We will go on plenty of hikes, and I will make sure he stays sharp." Harlan smiled brightly and let out a long breath of pure relief. "Thank you, Knox. That means the world to me. His name is Ranger, by the way." Knox left the hospital room an hour later and walked directly down to the animal holding facility. A young veterinary technician led him to a large chain-link run at the back of the building. The German Shepherd was pacing anxiously back and forth across the concrete floor. The moment the dog saw Knox approaching, it stopped dead in its tracks. Its ears perked up high, and its tail began to wag furiously. Knox opened the metal gate and stepped inside. Ranger immediately bounded forward and pressed his heavy head firmly against Knox's leg, letting out a soft, joyful whine. Knox knelt down and rubbed the thick fur behind the dog's ears. He snapped a heavy tactical leash onto Ranger's sturdy leather collar. They walked out of this hospital facility together, stepping into the bright morning sunlight. Knox looked down at his new loyal partner, and Ranger looked right back up at him with intelligent amber eyes. The remote mountain vacation had certainly not gone according to plan, but Knox knew he was walking away with something far more valuable than a few days of peace and quiet. He had found a true partner for life. The story of Knox and Ranger shows us that true loyalty and courage transcend species. Sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the darkest and most dangerous places. Knox went to the mountains seeking peace and isolation, but he returned with a brave partner for life. It reminds us that answering a call for help, even when it requires stepping into the unknown, can change our lives forever. Animals have an incredible capacity for devotion, and they often bring out the absolute best in us when we need it most. If this story of bravery and unbreakable bonds moved you, please consider sharing it with your friends and family. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Knox and Ranger's incredible escape. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories about the amazing connections between humans and animals.